All right, let's dive into a really cool story today. It's about two students, Kesser and Steen, who took on a classic tech challenge for their class, nature and innovation. The mission? Can you teach an old computer new tricks? We're going to see how they brought a decade-old laptop back from the brink for a pretty cutting-edge project.
It's a question we've probably all asked ourselves, right? You look at that old piece of tech gathering dust and wonder, is this just e-waste? Or could a little bit of clever thinking give it a second chance? Well, that is the exact challenge Kesser and Steen decided to take on.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics here. Kesser and Steen weren't just tinkering around for fun. No, this project had a very specific and pretty demanding task that needed some serious processing power. So their goal was to get this piece of software called EasyOCR up and running. It's a tool for recognizing text and images, and the thing is, it needs a modern setup. We're talking specific software libraries like Python and PyTorch. The problem? The only hardware they could get their hands on was an older, hand-me-down laptop.
And here's the machine in question, a trusty old Lenovo ThinkPad. Now, for its age, the specs are actually pretty decent, especially the 8 gigs of RAM. But the really crucial part here, the detail that makes this whole thing possible, is that Intel Core i7 processor. Why? Because it's a 64-bit chip. And that little fact, well, it's the key to everything.
So what do you do? How do you tackle this? Well, instead of trying to fight with the old Windows 10 system that was on there, Kesser came up with a really clever idea. And his idea was just brilliant because it was so simple. Just run a completely different operating system, Linux, directly from a USB drive. You see, since the ThinkPad has that standard Intel chip, they could use almost any version of Linux out there. This lets them completely sidestep all the compatibility nightmares you might run into with other types of processors. Their mentor, a Mr. Hendricks, gave them 3 really solid Linux options to choose from. First up, you have Ubuntu, kind of the popular, stable workhorse of the bunch. Then there's Linux Mint, which is famous for being super user-friendly, especially on older machines. And finally, MX Linux, the super lightweight speedster for when you need to squeeze out every last drop of performance. Each one had its own pros. So, with their options laid out, they decided to start with the biggest name on the list, Ubuntu. It's known for being reliable, it's a great starting point for developers. It really seemed like the safest bet. Here was their game plan. It's a classic 4-step recipe, probably familiar to anyone who's ever installed a new OS. You download the system file, use a tool to prep the USB, restart the computer, and kick off the installation. Sounds simple, right? And here you can see them right in the middle of step 2. They're using this great little tool called Rufus to get the USB drive all set up. And see that persistent partition size setting? That is an absolutely crucial detail. It basically means they can save files and changes right on the USB drive, which turns it into a portable, pocket-sized computer. So the prep work was a total breeze. In less than 8 minutes, their bootable USB was good to go. They rebooted the ThinkPad, feeling pretty optimistic, totally ready to fire up their new Ubuntu system. But this is where our story takes a little bit of an unexpected turn. Because as anyone who's ever worked with tech knows, even the simplest plans can go completely sideways. This is that moment that every project has, right? The one where you followed all the instructions, you've checked all the boxes, and still, it just doesn't work. For Kesser and Steen, that moment came the second they rebooted that machine. Yeah, despite all their careful prep, and even with their mentor, Mr. Hendricks, helping them tweak some technical BIOS settings, the ThinkPad just flat out refused to boot from the Ubuntu USB. The newer Ubuntu version probably just had a kernel or a driver that didn't get along with the ThinkPad's specific hardware. So the afternoon turned into this long, frustrating session, which is pretty beautifully summed up by their grandma baking cookies just to keep their spirits up. But hey, this is a story about perseverance. The next day, Mr. Hendricks came back, not with a magic fix, but with some encouragement. He reminded them about their other options and told them not to give up. It was time for Plan B. So, taking his advice, Steen downloaded their second choice, Linux Mint. Now, it's based on Ubuntu, but it's well known for being lighter and faster, which makes it a perfect candidate for older hardware that might be just a little bit picky. And it worked, just like that. They repeated the exact same process, but this time the computer booted up perfectly without a single problem. The key difference here is that Linux Mint often uses a slightly older, more proven software base. That just means it had better support for the ThinkPad's components right out of the box. It was a perfect match. But to be absolutely 100% sure everything was working, Steen ran one last test. He copied a file from the old Windows hard drive onto his new Linux Mint desktop, rebooted the computer, and checked if the file was still there. And it was. Their persistent storage was working. Mission accomplished. You know, Kesser and Steen's story is just a fantastic lesson in problem solving. They proved that sometimes the newest, shiniest software isn't actually the best fit, and that with the right approach, old tech isn't obsolete. It's an opportunity. It really makes you wonder, what kind of potential is hiding in that old laptop you've got sitting in your closet?